Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to finally give you my Sony ILCE-1 review. This new high-speed 50 megapixel and also 30 frame per second and also 8K recording camera is Sony's not only answer to the EOS R5, but their one-upmanship in this ever-progressing game of competition between these two titans at the top of the mirrorless space. Of course, when Canon released the EOS R5, it felt like a step beyond anything that Sony was offering, and particularly after a somewhat lackluster fourth generation of Sony cameras in which the A7R Mark IV and the A9 Mark II, while wonderful cameras, were only incremental upgrades over their predecessors. And the EOS R5 came and it seemed like it had, a lot going for it. And so the ILCE-1 is not only Sony's response, but it is advancing the ball up the field by giving you a little bit of everything, though at a huge price tag. And it's that price tag that initially left me feeling kind of nonplussed about the ILCE-1. It just seems so expensive, over $2,000 more than the EOS R5. Enough headroom in there to buy, basically buy an EOS R5 and an EOS R6. And, for a similar kind of price. But as I thought about it longer, the idea of the ILCE-1 continued to grow on me as I realized that it could do everything that my R3, A7R Mark III could do and better, everything that my A9 could do and better, and if I happen to buy an A7S III, everything it can do and better. And I began to realize, this might be a camera that I might really be interested in. So long story short, at the time of this review, I have sold both my A7R Mark III and my A9 to help fund a purchase of the ILCE-1. And to that end, I do want to say a big thanks to Camera Canada, who has been my go-to for actually purchasing gear here in Canada for the last year or so, and they've been fantastic to work with. And my buddy Kedar there, he went above and beyond to make sure that I got an ILCE-1 as soon as possible and really bent over backwards to make sure that he took care of me. So thanks to Camera Canada, and if you're looking for a retailer here in Canada, I've had nothing but great success with them and their service. They've got a great website, so check them out.
Today's episode is sponsored by NordVPN, the VPN selected as the best in 2020 by VPN Mentor and recommended by top technology experts. Due to the pandemic, we are all online more than ever, and that means our precious data is even more at risk. NordVPN anonymizes your browsing data, protects your personal information, and even enables you to access content blocked in certain regions. Using NordVPN is incredibly simple, with apps for all your devices that allow you to get protected with just a click of a button. And with over 5,500 servers in 59 countries worldwide, it is easy to get protection without compromising speed. Visit NordVPN/Dustin or use coupon code Dustin to get 70% off your subscription.
I also want to thank NordVPN today and our sponsor of today's episode. I've been using NordVPN for the last couple of years, and particularly in this last year with everybody having too much time on their hands, including hackers. It's been a time that I've really liked the peace of mind that comes with anonymizing my browsing and making sure that my personal information is safe. So thanks to NordVPN for that. Today we're doing the definitive review where we're going to take a deep dive on all aspects of the ILCE-1. I will follow that up with a kind of more focused, a deeper dive into the image quality, sensor performance difference between the ILCE-1 and the EOS R5. And then I'll also have the standard review at the end of the week if you want to check that out. We're going to start by taking a look at the build and the design. And, from the outside, this looks like a really familiar camera. I bought this very expensive camera. I showed it to my wife, and her response was, "Looks a lot like your other cameras," which was absolutely right. On the outside, it doesn't look radically different than anything we've seen from Sony before. In fact, you might be excused for thinking it looks just like previous cameras, but it's what's on the inside that counts. Let's jump in, let's take a closer look at what you've got here and maybe what needs still to be upgraded. So the first thing that stands out really is how familiar the ILCE-1 looks. Sure, this is a camera that costs several thousand more than any of the Sony mirrorless cameras like this that we've seen previously, but from the outside you really can't tell what a robust machine it is because it looks really similar. We have overall dimensions of nearly 129 millimeters in width. It is 96.9 millimeters in height and right under 70 millimeters in its overall depth. And so in that sense, it is very, very similar to previous bodies like the A9 Mark II or even the A7R Mark IV. Now the camera does weigh more than previous Sony bodies. It's 737 grams versus about 665 grams for, say, the A7R Mark IV and slightly more than that for the A9 Mark II. And so it is heavier, but not significantly so. That extra weight is probably made up mostly in enhanced build quality, in that there is there's a more enhanced structural build to it, including a beefed up mount that helps to support heavier lenses. It also has more internal sealing, and so now I think that we've finally gotten over the hump where Sony's weather sealing is not comparable to other kind of high-end cameras, and I think they've gotten there now. One feature that I'm really excited about is that Sony has now implemented a setting that you can choose to where the shutter mechanism will now come down and actually cover the sensor when the camera is powered off, which helps to keep dust off the sensor, something that has been a huge problem for me in times past with other Sony cameras. Now, looking at it from the exterior, the button placement, the placement of the dials is all fairly similar. Unlike the Canon EOS R5 or similar cameras, there is no top-mounted LCD, but I don't find that I miss it all that much because there are so many physical controls on tap here. There are three different dials on the top. The dial on the left, which is something unique to the A9 and now the Alpha-1, is a two-tier dial that on the top allows you to choose your drive mode, and underneath that it allows you to choose your focus mode, which is handy to have on the fly. On the right side of the camera, we have the typical mode dial and then the exposure compensation dial. The one thing I will point out that's a little bit odd is that two of the dials require you to press in the center and rotate, whereas the exposure compensation has an actual locking mechanism in the middle that is either locked or unlocked, and it clicks rather than holding it down. So I don't know why there isn't a consistency between those overall. Outside of that, you have the typical button placement pretty much everywhere that you would expect that is very similar over a lot of different Sony cameras. One of the upgrades here is that there is an enhanced shutter mechanism, and it's actually got carbon fiber as a part of it. There's less vibration with it, and as a byproduct of that, you also get a smoother sound even when using the mechanical shutter. It's a little bit more damped, I find, and it has that really satisfying feel to it. The viewfinder is also a point of significant upgrade. This is a 9.44 million dot resolution, which is really significant. It's higher than anything we've seen on a Sony camera before. And one of the areas on the A9 Mark II that was disappointing is it was only 3.68 million dots. And so this 9.44 million dots is fantastic resolution, and it can have a refresh rate as fast as 240 frames per second. It's physically just a little bit larger in its opening, 0.64 versus the typical 0.5 inches, and also its magnification level is higher at 0.9 times. And so that is a significant difference here. What isn't significantly improved is the LCD screen, which is still a somewhat disappointing resolution of 1.44 million dots and remains only a 3-inch, whereas some of the competitors have a 3.2-inch screen and a higher resolution. And so certainly that is something that could have been further upgraded. Also could have been further upgraded is to have a fully articulating screen rather than the typical limitations of the tilting screen that we have got here. Now, one thing that is significantly upgraded, however, is the touch responsiveness and the ability now to fully navigate both the quick and the full menu via touch. Now, the full menu is still a little bit small in terms of the font and the size of things to have as much precision maybe as what you would like in terms of touching, but I do find that it works relatively well, and certainly there seems to be less lag on input now, and so that's certainly a welcome upgrade, something that I've been harping on ever since I have been reviewing Sony cameras. Now, there is a little bit of redesign to the opening on the card door, and here you also have kind of dual purpose slots, and that they can accept both CEF Express Type A's or SD UHS 2 cards. Now, at this point, CFS Express A's are both rare and really, really expensive. And so not all that tempting an option. The good news, however, is that there seems to be relatively little penalty for using SD cards instead, unless you're at the highest bit rates of 8K video. But you're able to do up to 30 frames per second and up to 8K video capture, even using V60 rated SD cards. And so the cards that I use are actually V90 rated, and I haven't run into any limitations. So I'm going to hold off on CF Expresses for now until the prices drop, and I certainly would recommend that you consider doing the same. There's obviously been a really nice improvement over the last generation of Sony bodies on the actual compartments on the left side of the camera where the various ports are. We've got a lot of functionality in these ports, including the fastest connection any camera has had via Ethernet here. And beyond that, you've got the typical, headphone and mic input jacks. You have got a full-size HDMI port, somewhat surprising. You've got a USB-C where it can be charged over that, though I will note that charging has gotten a little bit more complicated here. You do need to have a device with the power delivery codec or option on it to actually power the camera. And I found even with that, it can be a little bit finicky. And so it's certainly not as versatile as what we've seen in times past. The nice thing, however, there by powering it is that you do have the option for long format recording and using external power. There's also a multifunction mini USB port on towards the bottom there as well. Now, the battery pack is the typical NP-FZ100 that we have seen now in a number of cameras going back to the original A9. The overall rating from SEPA is a little bit lower here at 430 shots, probably because of the enhanced kind of processing. There's a lot of current draw, due to that in this particular camera. However, I will note that it really depends on what you're shooting. For example, I went out and shooting burst for testing autofocus. I shot about 1,000 frames over the course of half an hour, and I didn't exhaust any more than about, I would say, 25% of the battery tops. And so it is going to be somewhat specific to what you are doing. Expect in most use cases to get much more than that rating, although it's always smart to have an extra battery or two there. One other thing I will point out is, like the last couple of cameras from Sony I've tested, is the actual hot shoe is also like a digital interface to where you can hook up some new Sony microphones that do give you digital auto recording at the hot shoe as well. So as noted, the Alpha-1 does have an improved enhanced mechanical shutter. Now, the advantage of that is that I found that the smoothness of the shutter mechanism, it has such low vibration that I didn't really notice a significant difference between the mechanical and the electronic shutter in terms of introducing vibration when trying to hand hold and use the in-body image stabilization. So that's something that's handy there. So you do get up to 10 frames per second using the mechanical shutter. Here's what that looks and sounds like. Now, at the heart of the Alpha-1, however, this is designed around an electronic shutter, and they've helped us solve some of the problems that have been inherent to electronic shutters along the way, including things like rolling shutter when you're panning either in taking stills or in video, and in that panning, having a faster readout from the sensor helps them to get away from lines that should be upright, leaning as a part of that. Also, as a part of that, they've been able to solve what is a typical problem with, let's say, not being able to use flash sync, which you can now use flash sync up to 1/200th of a second, even using the electronic shutter, up to 1/400th of a second using the mechanical shutter, which is the highest sync figure that I've seen previously. Another problem with electronic shutters that they've been able to solve is that you can actually utilize anti-flicker even using the electronic shutter, which means that you don't have to slow down your burst rate if you're shooting under difficult lighting conditions in a stadium, for example, and you can still use the anti-flicker technology. You may not get 30 frames per second, but you'll probably get better than 10 frames per second, which is certainly going to be an advantageous thing. Now, when it comes to in-body image stabilization, we're still rated at 5.5 stops, and so I find that in some ways, while there has been subtle enhancements in that I do see Sony's in-body image stabilization getting better by degrees, they no longer have an advantage like they once did, and so companies like Canon now have, in their R5 and R6 cameras, have higher ratings for stabilization than what Sony does. And I've even seen with like Fuji getting slightly better performance maybe than what we're seeing from Sony. What Sony has added into the mix here, along with some basic refinements to hand-holding for stills, is that there is now an active mode when shooting video. So take a look at this scene without any kind of stabilization, just handheld. You can see lots of that seasick kind of movement. And even if we turn on just the normal in-body image stabilization, you can see that there's still kind of that rocking that makes you a little bit nauseous looking at it. Now, if I engage the active mode, it does smooth things out, though with a bit of a crop factor. I also find that the footage maybe drops a little bit in terms of overall resolution, but certainly an improvement there. All told, I see that there are a number of improvements that have come into play with the ergonomics. The grip feels a little bit better than ever before, though I still like to use a grip extender, to fit my hands better. But overall, what we have got here is a very familiar kind of body, though with some durability and functionality upgrades that make it maybe the best execution of this familiar Sony design that we've ever seen before, with the one exception is that we should have at this price point seen a bit of an improvement to the rear LCD screen. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's mostly that LCD screen that is my only complaint. Finally, it is touch, so kudos to them on that. However, I would love to have seen a fully articulating screen here, and a bump in resolution would certainly have been welcome, and I think probably warranted on such an expensive camera like this. So let's talk about autofocus. Autofocus is obviously a huge aspect of why you might consider investing in the Alpha-1, which is a sports camera that might be the best that we've ever seen before. Let's dive in and let's take a look. Now, obviously, the Alpha-1, like the A9 cameras, is really designed to be an ultimate sports kind of camera. And they've taken basically the equation from the A9 cameras and taken it to a whole new level. Whereas before you had up to 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, you now have up to 30 frames per second. We've also seen a bit of a boost from, I believe, around 690 to 97 AF points, phase detect AF points, up to 759. Though that figure in itself is not necessarily overly impressive when you look at, some of the competing numbers. And at the end of the day, I really think that sometimes that comes down to more marketing than anything. What really kind of matters to me is that you have a lot of points that cover a large percentage of the frame, which you've got here. But although it's interesting that while there are more AF points, you go down from 93% coverage to 92% coverage from the A9 Mark II to the Alpha-1. Why? I don't really know. I don't think that it really makes probably a practical difference, that 1 percentage point. It does seem to me as I look at the AF point spread that maybe the Alpha-1's points are a little bit more precise, which could help with some other things like shooting macro, for example, or portraits, where you want to get a point on maybe a little bit more specific an area. But what I found overall that matters a lot here is not just the amount of phase detect points, but rather what the camera can do with those points. And in this case, somehow Sony has managed to double the amount of calculations that are being made per second. Already the A9 Mark II is impressive in that it could do 60 calculations per second. And when I say calculations, I mean not only focus calculations, but remember that for every one of those focus calculations, there also needs to be an accompanying metering calculation to make sure that shots are properly exposed, even when tracking action at high speed. In this case, they've doubled that to 120 calculations per second, which means that not only is there a lot of AF points, but the increased processing power in the Alpha-1 means that the camera is able to do more with the autofocus system and thus give you even more accurate results. Now, you're always going to run into a practical limit when you're shooting that many frames per second, that you can only shoot so many frames before the buffer starts to fill. Though Sony has done a good job with this all along, beginning with the A9. In this case, you get 182 JPEGs if you're shooting extra fine, but if you just go to fine JPEGs, you can get 400, which gives you a pretty long phase to work with, time frame to work with, even at 30 frames per second. Now, if you're shooting lossy RAWs, so not lossless, but lossy RAWs, you can get up to 238 raw images. That figure drops, however, to 96 if you're shooting lossless, and a little bit lower than that if you're shooting an uncompressed RAW. But I mean, 238 lossy RAWs is obviously still a very, very useful figure and will allow you to get lots of frames. Frankly, when I was out and I was shooting burst, and as I typically do, I went out and I shot sequences with dogs, and so you can start to see those here. I never found any kind of limitation. I never ran out to where the buffer filled before I was done with a sustained burst, and so I have no complaints there. What I did notice, however, is that there was a pretty distinct difference between using the Sigma, which I've got here on the camera at the moment, the Sigma 100 to 400 millimeter DN lens, which is a really excellent lens at a reasonable price. But I did see a difference, no doubt about it. For one thing, I got about a maximum of 15 frames per second using the Sigma. And I also found that I had definitely some more misses where focus was either front or back focused. I would say that my perfectly focused rate was somewhere around 70%, which is not bad when you're tracking fast, demanding action. But then I threw on the 135 millimeter G Master lens, f1.8 G Master, and even though I was shooting at f2.2 or f2 throughout the sequence, number one, I jumped up to 30 frames per second. So if you want that 30 frames per second, it seems like you're going to want to use a Sony lens to unlock that. But beyond that, the focus was impeccable, flawless. I would have burst with, obviously when you're shooting 30 frames per second, the frames add up very quickly. But I could look through them one by one, and every one of them was just perfectly focused. It really was an incredible, incredible experience. And so it does, suggest to me that if you're going to invest in a camera as expensive as the Alpha-1, you're probably going to want to put the better glass in front of it because you're going to get the full potential of your camera unlocked by doing so. I also noted that they've added a bird IAF mode onto this. Now, unfortunately, you do have to toggle between, human, animal, and bird AF. And so that's maybe a little bit of a pain. And I did find that it wasn't foolproof, that sometimes, for example, I was out shooting Canada geese, the bird IAF would drop onto their tail. They kind of duck down into the water, digging after something there, and they'll pop back up. And even when they were fully upright, sometimes it would flop over onto the tail. Something about that feather arrangement would confuse it. But at the same time, as I zoomed into picture after picture, they were perfectly focused. And so as long as you don't take the shot when it's focused on the tail, which is pretty obvious, then you should be able to get good results. Another thing that I actually was really impressed by is that out of kind of my peripheral, I saw a red-throated blackbird take off, or a red-winged blackbird. I can't remember what they're called, but it took off, and I quickly turned and shot. I only had one frame that I took because I only had a split second, and I was actually shocked to find that the shot was perfectly focused, which really did impress me. And in another sequence there where I think it was probably hunting bird or insects in the air, everything was flawless in terms of that capture. And so certainly you're getting very, very good results with animals and even with birds, though I don't know if the bird IF is quite as good as what, say, the Canon EOS R5 or R6 is, but it's very, very, very good. One other thing that I noted is that at this point, human IEF is a technology that Sony has pretty much perfected at this point. But what they have improved here is the ability to kind of work at the angles when a subject is kind of looking away. And one of the very first shots that I took with the Alpha-1 once it arrived really impressed me because my daughter kind of looked away laughing. But as I shot, and then I just double tapped on the LCD screen to kind of take a look, and a big smile crossed my face because, as you can see, it just nailed the proper focus, even though it really couldn't see the eye properly. And so the technology and the AI that's working in the camera is getting just better and better all along. This truly is one of the best focusing cameras that you're ever going to find to this point in history, and certainly one of the best action cameras that's ever been created. So nothing but good stuff there. I mean, my bottom line on autofocus is that the Alpha-1 has done everything that I've expected it to do and more. It's fantastic. It's given me great results top to bottom. And of course, those autofocus results for stills also carry over into video performance, where it's more reliable than ever for tracking my face in episodes like this. And although I'm filming on the EOS R5 at the moment, which also is incredible at that, by the way, the Alpha-1 has proved utterly reliable when it's the camera recording rather than being on camera like this. But let's talk a little bit more about video performance and dive into that. So when it comes to the video side of the Alpha-1, unlike the A9 cameras, it is not limited in any way, shape, or form. Now, I'm no video expert, and if you really are focused on the video side of the Alpha-1, there are probably other reviewers that can give you a little more of a deep dive into the video side of things. But with the A9 and the A9 Mark II, they actually had really good looking footage, but they had very few options if you wanted to actually grade that footage. No picture profiles, no S-Log, none of the more advanced video features. In the Alpha-1, Sony has basically thrown everything that they've got, that they might put into an A7S III into the Alpha-1. And so you've got tons of options. I mean, there's lots and lots of menu options that you can scroll through that are going to give you just really control over pretty much everything. And so that includes obviously a full range all the way up to 8K 30 when it comes to your options of resolution. Supporting that is a number of different bit rates at each different resolution level, which obviously is very, very useful. I don't actually have a use yet for 8K, maybe you do, and so it's not something that I'm using as of yet, but I certainly do love having the flexibility at 4K, including going up to 4K 120. And having that ability to not just, slow down kind of the typical motion, someone shooting a jump or riding a skateboard, that kind of thing. I just find that there's a lot of creative options even out in nature where something that is moving a little bit too fast to work on a camera, like falling snow, going to 120 frames per second and then slowing that down is beautiful, or water rushing, in the spring melt, things like that. There's just some extra poetic, creative license that you have as a byproduct of having that 4K 120. So I really, really actually love that. I also love the fact that there is no record limit with the Alpha-1. I tend to do a lot of long format recording. I do teaching sessions, things like that. And it's really a pain to actually run into that 29:59 recording limit. Sometimes I even set a timer on my watch, and so I can be thinking in advance to stop at a point where it's logical for editing. But even so, you got to get up, interrupt your train of thought, stop the recording, start a fresh recording, and then because I record audio separately typically, you got to sync the audio back up and post, and so it's just extra steps. So I love having no recording limit. And beyond that, they've actually designed, thinking about the heat problems, the overheating problems that really became, kind of the major headline when it came to Canon's release of the EOS R5 and R6. Frankly, I think that in many cases that was overblown. It's never been a problem for me personally, but I do recognize that for some of you that record a lot of video, you're video-centric, it has been a problem. So in this case, it's fairly easy to record 30 minutes from what I understand of 8K, as long as you've got the space to record that without overheating. And you don't have the long time in between where the camera's got to cool down before you can start to use it again. And so that aspect of it is nice as well. And when it comes to 4K type recording, no real problem, no real kind of practical limits when it comes to heat there. It also has the full range of picture profiles, S-Log, HLG recording, all of those things. And to top it all off, they've thrown in the S-Cinetone profile. I'm actually filming on it right now. It's a great looking bit of footage that does give you a little bit of editing flexibility, but just is a naturally great looking bit of footage that matches up well with their other Cine cameras. And so overall, they've really given you an A7S III packed into an action camera body. And so there's not a whole lot to complain about. Now, is it worth buying just for that? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, that's going to be up to you. It's a whole lot more expensive than an A7S III. But if you're like many people today that do both, stills photography and videography, you want one camera that does everything and does it all well, it's hard to argue with what the ILCE-1 delivers. So again, nothing but praise for the video performance from the ILCE-1. It's just got all of the Sony options you can expect, and it solves a lot of the problems that cameras like the EOS R5 and the R6 have encountered. So finally, let's talk about sensor performance here. This is a brand new sensor, the 50 megapixel. This is a stacked BSI sensor, like we've seen in the A9 bodies in the past, A9, A9 Mark II. Those were only 24 megapixels, and while I actually really liked the look of images in terms of their detail and their color, on the technical level, they really weren't quite up to the level not only of the R3 and the R4, but even the A7 III bested the A9 when it came to dynamic range and high ISO performance. So Sony has pulled out all the stops here and given us a brand new sensor that manages to continue to have that really high readout speed, which the stacked sensor allows you to do, and so that data can go through at 30 frames per second. And by the way, with very little compromise, if you were switching between the mechanical and the electronic shutter, the dynamic range is within a percentage point, a small percentage point between the two shutter types. And so there's really very little compromise there for using the electronic shutter, which is fantastic because that's where the speed lies. But they've also managed to give you technical performance as well, with better dynamic range, better high ISO performance. Let's dive in and take a closer look at that. So first of all, I want to take a look at whether or not this 50 megapixel sensor is delivering in terms of our resolution. And so here, jumping into this image at a pixel level, you can see that it truly is giving us really fantastic detail across the frame here, and able to give us nice local contrast and just a fantastic amount of detail. So no problem there, even though this is a long exposure image here. Here's another shot that gives us a look at a landscape type scene, and because there is such deep resolution throughout the frame and a lot of pixels to work with, you can go to something like this, for example. This is a deep crop from that image, and obviously you're still going to have a lot of detail. And I'm on a 4K monitor, so we don't have 4K worth of resolution left in this deep crop. It's over 2,300 pixels on the long end, and so plenty for photo sharing sites. Even in the midst of very high-speed action, you're able to get images that just really have great resolution, and that is kind of the key to this particular sensor in that fast readout, is that here in the midst of a burst of 30 frames per second, this individual frame from the electronic shutter shows great detail. It's a 50 megapixel image, captured in just a split second, perfectly focused, and great information there for editing, processing, whatever you're going to do with it. Now, one of the unique features that I really like here is that you have an option at the 21 megapixel level. You can either go with an APS-C crop, or as we've got here, you can actually go with an oversampled full frame JPEG. And so the oversample means that you're packing lots of detail into these JPEGs. And so even though it's 21 megapixels, which is not a massive amount these days, this is still as much resolution as I had back in my Canon EOS 6D days. And you can see that there's just a fantastic amount of detail and resolution. Again, this is a frame that is frozen from high-speed action, and you can see that it's got great detail. Here's another one, for example, a static shot here, and so you can see that in even a landscape type setting, there is great detail in these JPEGs at 21 megapixel. And so to me, I really love this feature once I discovered it, because it allows me an option to continue to have the full frame look, but to have a lower resolution point, which could be really useful for shooting events, shooting something where you want a usable quick image to give to a client. Getting that 21 megapixel JPEG is, to me, really fantastic. And then of course you could go with a crop if you happen to want a little bit more reach. But I've never seen before on a Sony camera the ability to retain the full frame sensor, but to shoot at a highly detailed, lower resolution that is actually oversampled to give you that detail. I found even when shooting long distance shots here, I was probably about 120 feet away from this subject, so around 30-meter range, and it still was able to resolve this, admittedly difficult subject here because of the black on the neck. The eyes don't stand out very well, but you can see it's perfectly focused and has great detail despite that long distance reach. I've also really liked the color science in the Alpha-1. I feel like it is a steady evolution of improvement to where I've found colors just, to have a little more flexibility for processing. As you can see, there's fantastic detail in the image itself, but the colors have a nice quality to them, and I found it to be fairly easy to process. Here's one more example here. And early in the morning, and the colors here, they are deeply saturated without becoming garish, and there's flexibility in all the different color tones here for me to push or work the image a little bit, but still having a great resolution out of it. I used to find sometimes with Sony color that you'd switch to, say, a landscape, a little more intense or vivid type saturation level, and immediately the image would the colors to me would just kind of go garish and unnatural. I don't find that to be true any longer. I think that they've made some, just again, evolutionary tweaks to where their color science is just more flexible and a wider variety of situations. I really, really like these images on a global, and then of course they hold up very well on a technical level as well because of great resolution in that sensor. So of course the Alpha-1 is a little bit higher resolution than the Canon EOS R5. It's 45 megapixels versus the 50 megapixels, but they're fairly close. I wanted to use the exact same lens. In this case, it's a Canon lens. It's an EF mount, so I can adapt it to both cameras, and to see how they compared resolution-wise. So what we can see here is obviously the Alpha-1 is delivering great amounts of detail, just a little bit more, I would say, sharpness than what you can see from the Canon. The Canon, however, does have a low pass filter, which does help with moire in a way that the Alpha-1 doesn't. It doesn't seem to be quite as bad as the R3 from what I can see in this similar kind of situation, but you can see a little bit of false color here, whereas it's not showing up on the R5. We'll take another look at another section. You can just see once again, they both look really, really fantastic. Tons of detail, but I think that there is a slight advantage in detail for the Alpha-1, and we'll look at one other spot here. And again, it's hard to see a tremendous amount of difference here, but I do see just the slightest advantage in terms of detail rendering for the Alpha-1. And so anyway, just to give you an idea of if it's holding up in terms of resolution. So we'll take a quick look at our ISO performance here. So higher resolution bodies are obviously at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to higher ISO performance, just because of the sheer amount of pixels, which means that false noise, those kind of things are going to show up more obviously. So let's take a look here at base ISO, gives you an idea of how everything should look, and then up to ISO 1600. Now in this case, it's basically near impossible to tell much of a difference between the base ISO and 1600. There is the slightest hint of maybe some noise developing there, but it looks really, really fantastic. No problem there. Jumping on up to 6400 on a global level, basically the images look identical, color saturation, all of those things. There's no kind of any tint that is showing up in the image. Everything looks great. On a pixel level, we can see that there is starting to develop a bit of a fine noise, particularly in these areas where shadows start to develop. We can see that contrast, like in the grip, continues to look really, really excellent. Down here you can see a little bit of that pattern noise there, but our blacks are still nice and inky and no real loss of detail anywhere. That trend continues at 12,800. The noise pattern is ever so slightly more obvious, but still very, very faint. Again, color levels, saturation levels are all still looking good. Contrast still looking good. And down here we can see that the noise pattern is getting a little bit rougher. You can see just a little bit of unevenness that is out here in just the pure black area. But again, our contrast levels, everything still looks fairly inky and dark. You don't have that kind of washed out look that can sometimes affect higher ISO results. So now at 25,600, which I would consider kind of maybe a natural limit these days for modern cameras. And once again, here on a global level, as you can see, everything continues to look really good. I would say that there's ever so slightly less contrast in this grip by comparison. But, again, overall detail looks good, saturation levels still looking good. Jumping into a pixel level, you can see that contrast, just some of this pattern is a little bit more muddled as a byproduct of some noise creeping in. The timer face still looks quite good, I think, and very kind of a film grain type quality there to the noise. In that shadow area, you can see a little bit of roughness, but again, contrast levels are still looking pretty good, even though we're getting a little bit more of those, different luminosity pixel showing up out there, and the pattern noise is getting rougher. Now the native limit on the Alpha-1 is 32,000, and so in that step, 1/3 step between 25,600 and 32,000. Frankly, there's not a massive difference. I think that the noise is darkening just a little bit, but the two images look more similar than different. Even out here in this noise, there is, it's more similar than different, just slightly rougher, but still usable, I would say, in certain situations. Now you don't hit 51,200 until you go out into the expanded zone, and I don't recommend doing that basically ever in cameras. As you can see here, much more uneven darkness levels there, contrast is starting to drop off, and you can see that the noise level is getting definitely much rougher and uglier here in this area, and you can see a little bit of discoloration relative to even the 32,000. And so I recommend, again, 25,600, 32,000 in a pinch. Don't go any higher than that. So going back to 25,600, let's take a peek at the A7R3, which has always been really excellent to me in high ISO performance. And we can see here, I think it retains a little bit more contrast, and maybe the noise level is a little bit less rough. In some ways, this continues to be in the R3, I think one of Sony's best sensors ever. And it just strikes a good balance, in my opinion, between resolution and then, the performance at the edges, be it ISO or dynamic range. And so it's holding up really well in this comparison, I think. And so I don't necessarily see any advantages for the Alpha-1. Neither do I see any significant disadvantages, however. So finally, let's compare it to the R5. Now, you may have noticed if you were paying attention to the actual shutter speed that we got a slightly faster shutter speed with the R3, and then another third stop with the Canon EOS R5. Where that comes from is it seems like the Canon has the greatest amount of sensor sensitivity, the Alpha-1 has less, and so it requires more exposure to get equal exposure values. Just kind of a quirk of the way that the sensor is tuned. Not necessarily a big deal unless you're doing a direct comparison. But the byproduct is that the Canon needed about 2/3 less of a stop exposure to get an equal amount of exposure value. So taking a look in here, we can see that I think there is a slight advantage for the Canon in terms of the fineness of the noise. The noise is a little bit less rough in my opinion, but where the Alpha-1 wins is that I think that it does a little bit better job in retaining shadow information. And so you can see it's a little more inky out here, and the Canon the shadows are raising somewhat, and so as a byproduct it does lose a little bit of saturation and I would say overall contrast relative to the Sony result. So if we talk about dynamic range, some people like to evaluate dynamic range as to how much flexibility there is on the sliders, say in Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. And so what I've done here is I've taken this image and here's the base exposure as it came out of camera, and then I've maximized the sliders. So pulled the shadows all the way open, pull the highlights all the way down to see how much information we get back. So what we can see is that there definitely is some sky recovery in this area, and a good job there. In the shadow information itself, we can see that there is there's a fair amount of information that has been pulled back, things that have been obscured by the shadows. For example, over on this side of my shed, you can see that basically those logs were lost in the shadows. They've been pulled back and re-exposed by pulling those shadows open. So a fair amount of flexibility there. Let's see how it compares to the R5. So once again with the R5, you do see a little bit of an exposure difference there. And what I find is that there's a little bit more latitude, I think, in opening up shadows, though to me with a kind of a loss of contrast in the process. And so I do see a little bit more information there. Looking over in this area, we can see that there's a little bit more latitude for brightening up those shadows. But I think that the Sony has retained a little bit better level of contrast as well. That information is still there and visible, but I do actually prefer the contrast levels a little bit. And the Sony has done a little bit better job, I think, in pulling down highlights and retaining the blue of the sky relative to the Canon. So we'll explore that a little bit more deeply here with a more formal test. And so here we have got our base exposure. This shows you all the colors that should show up and information that should be there in the image itself. And so on the right, this has actually been underexposed by 5 full stops. And so obviously it is impressive that it looks similar on a global level. And if we zoom into a pixel level, we can see that there is a little bit of tinting, false color that is there, and some pattern noise. But overall, we've been able to recover shadow information really quite well. And so just to give you a look at how much we've recovered, here's what the base exposure looked like on this underexposed image before I pulled those shadows back. And so, I mean, looking at it on globally, you only had a few highlights showing up, the hint of some colors there, but all of this part of the chart with the, the darker colors was completely non-existent in the original exposure. So I think overall it has done a really nice job in retaining a similar look to the base exposure. Actually, the base exposure is flipped to here on the right. We'll flip them back again. But you can see it's done a very compelling job of retaining color fidelity and giving us a very nice looking result even after a deep, deep shadow recovery. Now the Canon didn't fare nearly as well in this similar comparison. You can see that some of these colors, there's kind of a magenta tint that has come into things in general. Even if we look at the facade of the camera here, you can see that this is much closer to the actual color than what you're seeing here on the Canon, and you can see here on the grip that it's definitely skewed towards magenta. You can see that also that in these colors here that everything is just more choppy relative to the better precision that we see from the Alpha-1. So the Alpha-1 takes the win there in shadow recovery. So in a similar fashion, we want to take a look at recovering highlights. And so here's a 3-stop of overexposure. You can see that lots of color swatches have washed out, but we can see that in the recovery here of bringing the exposure down 3 stops, we've actually done a pretty credible job of pulling in that color information. And I think more impressive still is that you've been able to reintroduce a pretty fair amount of contrast here to where darks look sufficiently dark and color saturation levels are fairly close. If we look back to the base ISO, we can see that in many ways there's a little bit of loss of color here of a peach tone, but the overall the color recovery has gone about fairly well with relatively few hot spots of information that has been lost. Now at a 4-stop overexposure, there's just too much information that has been lost, and so you can see, for example, here in the timer face that there's some of the color that should be there and the detail that has been lost, and I would say overall that our contrast levels are not compelling, and you can see that there are some color swatches that have been lost. If we switch over to the 4 stops of overexposure, we can see that Canon is definitely losing more colors. And so looking along this left line, you can see that most of the colors have been lost. That's true over here where basically all the yellows have disappeared as well. And so it's just not doing as good a job of retaining color. And you can see like the saturation level of the timer down here is not quite as good. And also in the face of the actual camera here, you can see a little bit more information has been lost relative to what Sony has been able to do. And so I do give a win to the Sony overall when it comes to dynamic range. So finally, how does that play out in the real world? Here's our original exposure, and you can see that I've been able to pull down and recover a lot of sky information. I can pull up the shadow information pretty much as much as I want, you know, kind of do it to taste, but there's lots of information that can be recovered there that, you know, for example, was lost in shadow, but can be, you know, restored by just opening up those shadows. And so, you know, overall, a very impressive sensor, particularly considering the fast readout of it. So my conclusion on the sensor performance is that not only am I loving the process of capturing images with the Alpha-1, I love the images that I get. I think that Sony has continually gotten better at refining its color science to where it's been a gradual process, but it just feels like colors are truer and there's a little more latitude for playing with color without it becoming garish, which has been my chief criticism of Sony color in times past. And so I love the look of the images, and I love them on a technical level as well. This camera feels like it can do everything that I want it to do, and I suspect that it will be rare, if ever, that I need to rely on something like bracketing of photos to give me enough, you know, headroom to have the dynamic range that I want out of a scene. And so I've been very, very pleased with the sensor performance along with all of the other aspects of the camera. So as you've probably detected at this point, there's really not a whole lot to criticize of the camera itself. You know, there's minor areas, tiny areas where the EOS R5 may be bested in some way, but there's also many areas where the Alpha-1 bests the EOS R5. They're both fantastic cameras, by the way, and I'm thrilled to own both of them. But really the major limitation here is going to be the price. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I passed on the upgrade cycle of the A7R4 and the A9 Mark II. They were incremental upgrades, and they're fantastic cameras, but to me there was no compelling reason to move from my R3 or my original A9 to their, you know, successors. But the Alpha-1 doesn't make me feel like I'm having to compromise on any front. It's like all the Sony goodies packed into one camera. But it's also priced accordingly to where you could buy several of those other cameras for the same price and maybe have a little change left in your pocket. And so it's not a camera for everyone. It's too much camera for some people. And unless you need the extreme action performance, you'd probably be better off buying an A7R Mark IV. And if you need action, but you don't need high resolution, the original A9 and the A9 Mark II continue to be very, very strong cameras. And if you're just a video person, as I mentioned in the video section, probably an A7S III makes more sense. But if you're the kind of person that wants a camera that can do everything, you know, in my case, in some ways, I need a camera that can do everything because of the wide variety of tests that I do. You know, so I took one for the team and I bought one for your sake. It's really all for you. I mean, I don't get anything out of this deal. Not really. I love the camera. But it's not for everyone. It costs too much, and it's not, you know, realistic for everyone to invest in it. However, it's also a better action camera than the 1DX Mark III that is priced just as high as that, or, you know, the Nikon D5. And so, I mean, this is an amazing camera, and it feels expensive, but at the end of the day, it's probably priced fairly reasonably for what it's offering in terms of absolute performance. I just hope that, you know, Canon doesn't respond by, you know, giving us an $8,000 camera or something like that. So at the end of the day, buy what you need. And if this is what you need, you're going to love the camera. If you don't need this much camera, there's a lot of compelling other options that don't necessarily make you pay for features that you're not really going to use. If you want more information, you can check out information in the description down below, including links to my full text review, also to an image gallery with a variety of lenses, some of which I can't even tell you about yet, but be sure to check that out as well. I would recommend that if you are interested in purchasing the camera, that you check out those buying links and you get your order in ASAP. Right now, there's lots of demand. There's not a whole lot of supply. And so the sooner you get in the queue, the sooner you're going to get one of these bad boys in your hands. There's also linkage there to check out my merch. There's new stuff being added all the time. You want to check that out. Also to become a patron or to sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell, and so you're notified when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.